All right, welcome everyone for this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I think everyone here has a certain amount of hope and trepidation as a mixed emotion moving through the current crisis, the current storm, facing all of civilization, but really concentrated here in the transatlantic, and especially for those sitting in the United States and Canada, where the density of both good and evil is probably greater than it's ever been. I understand and I feel that trepidation and that hope. I'm really excited because Sam Labrier, who's a very good friend, longtime ally, he's done a lot of incredible work, some authoritative research on the American system before 1776. For those who have not watched Sam's lectures on Vernadsky and the American system, on Colbert, Mazarin, and Émeric Vattel, and the cameralist origins of the American system that burst onto the scene, especially after 1776. I'm going to put those in the description box for people to review. Also, Sam's work on Henry C. Carey and the international battles between the British free traders and those protectionists who thought much more highly of humankind than the Malthusians. That is also something I'll make available as a link. So Sam agreed today to share some insights after having worked through some of the remarks and thoughts of a very important figure in world history who is, I think, highly undervalued, both for his role in sparking the fire in the hearts and minds of many people around why the American Revolution was so necessary, not just as an American phenomenon, but as a global, universal phenomenon. And the dark moments of despair that many felt in 1777, 78, when the troops weren't being paid, when there was a total bankruptcy, economic basket case situation with no ability really financially, and even in many ways logistically, to carry out the battle against the world's largest, most evil empire, the British Empire. There was a lot of despair, and the works of Thomas Paine was so important to give people focus. And I think today, just like then, the focus is lacking in the hearts and minds of many. And so revisiting Thomas Paine's methodology of thinking, both before, during, and after the War of Independence, is going to be very useful to see the parallels that we're living through today and the lessons we can glean. So Sam has agreed to share some of that with us. Today, Cynthia, Pascal, and myself have to do a bit of construction work in the back, so I'm going to be present for a little bit, but Magdalena and Jerry agreed to moderate the Q&A period, so they're going to be the ones who are going to take the helm very shortly, and like usual, just pop your names in the description box or put your little digital hand up, and Jerry and Madeline will call upon you to ask Sam a question or share a thought. Sam, it is all yours. Are you still there?
So, thanks for bearing with me. Sorry about that, everybody, but hopefully it will be worth everyone's while to gather on what is almost the anniversary of Thomas Paine's death, 3 days late. But Thomas Paine died June 8th, 1809. And finally, we're going to start to dive into the work of Thomas Paine and explore the righteous anger, I would call it, in Thomas Paine's writings that can be a source of inspiration even today. And hopefully we will find some meat to chew on, not just from 1776, but even applicable for the crises that we face in our world today. The first work by Thomas Paine. So why don't we go ahead and start with the first slide, and we'll go over Thomas Paine and his connection to Ben Franklin, because this is a pretty crucial aspect of Thomas Paine's life to understand where he comes from. So Thomas Paine was born an Englishman in England, and he returned. He was away at sea, and he returned in 1756 to London, and he was attending several lectures on science in London, and that was how he met Ben Franklin. There's some people who claim that he met Ben Franklin in 1774, but this is actually not true. They met many years earlier, and they had a very long relationship until their deaths. Ben Franklin called Thomas Paine his political son, and he sent Thomas Paine to America to write for the Philadelphia Journal. It's believed that the cost of the trip may have been paid by Ben Franklin, but Thomas Paine was actually very well connected in the Whig circles in England, and he likely would have had many sponsors besides Ben Franklin. There's sort of a false, a mistaken belief that he was impoverished and he was a failure in England. This is not true at all. This was a myth that was created by his Tory reactionary enemies and has been perpetuated by lazy historians. For example, in Lewes in England, Lewes was a Whig stronghold, and Thomas Paine was the only person for the 6 years prior to him leaving who sat continuously on the town's governing council. And as I said, it was a Whig stronghold in England. And there's growing evidence that Thomas Paine had been writing for 20 some odd years in England before he even left. It wasn't like he just woke up one morning and wrote Common Sense. He was a prolific author. The manuscript for Common Sense, it's believed to have been reviewed by several people before publication, including Ben Franklin, who some people think that Ben Franklin was actually the actual author of Common Sense, but actually the authorship of Common Sense by Thomas Paine is quite well documented. And it's believed that Ben Franklin only made some minor suggestions for changes. And he called him his political son. They were very much in agreement politically on most things. So it wasn't like he had to tell Thomas Paine what he wanted him to say, because they were in agreement on many things anyway. And the first copy of Common Sense off the press was given to Ben Franklin by Thomas Paine. It was also Ben Franklin that first responded favorably to the publication of Common Sense. He wrote anonymously as Candidus. And in 1776, in the spring, both Ben Franklin and Thomas Paine led the political fight in Pennsylvania to oust the British government there, to fight off the Tory faction in Pennsylvania who wanted reconciliation with a and against the Tory Loyalist Party in revolutionary America. So if you want to go to the next slide, we can just see, before we get started, a couple of quotes, famous quotes about Common Sense. So Thomas Jefferson: "No writer has exceeded Paine in ease and familiarity of style, in perspicuity of expression, happiness of elucidation, and in simple and unassuming language." And I don't know what to do here. Oh, never mind. There was like a RTF logo blocking the text for me, but I just moved it, so that's fine. So yeah, a couple of quotes on Common Sense. The next one was Nicholas Creswell, who was a Tory loyalist from Virginia. one of the vilest things that was ever published to the world. So whose principles are to subvert all kingly governments and erect an independent republic. The next one you might find surprising, from John Adams. And John Adams wrote, "I dreaded the effect so popular a pamphlet might have among the people, and determined to do all in my power to counteract the effect of it." People might find that surprising, but common sense, it was. So reconciliation before common sense with Britain, reconciliation with Britain was thought to be, among many people in America, thought to be, what was going to happen until this publication. And Thomas Paine, as we will see, he argues for a democratic Republican government in America. And so people may find it surprising that John Adams at the time was against that. And there's a whole other history there to go through of the, not the fight, but like the ideological battling that was done between Thomas Paine and John Adams. Dr. Benjamin Rush, he wrote, "Its effects were sudden and extensive upon the American mind." General Charles Lee wrote, "Have you read the pamphlet Common Sense? I never saw such a masterful performance. In short, I own myself convinced by the arguments of the necessity of separation," meaning separation with England. And then lastly, this one, not with Thomas Paine's contemporaries, but I found it important, from Thomas Edison. "I always regarded Paine as one of the greatest of all Americans. Never have we had a sounder intelligence in this republic. It was my good fortune to encounter Thomas Paine's works in my boyhood. It was indeed a revelation to me to read that great thinker's views on political and theological subjects. Paine educated me then about many matters of which I had never before thought. I remember very vividly the flash of enlightenment that shone from Paine's writings. And I recall thinking at that time, what a pity these works are not the school books for all children. My interest in Paine was not satisfied by my first reading of his works. I went back to them time and again, just as I have done since my boyhood days." So as we see, great Americans continued to be inspired by Thomas Paine throughout the history of the Republic, and hopefully we can get a little inspiration from him today. I think we will hopefully have time to finish Common Sense. We'll see how long it goes, and maybe we can get into a little bit of the crisis papers, but I have a feeling we'll have to save the crisis papers for another session, because if Common Sense is I don't have the entire Common Sense here, I have excerpts, but the entire Common Sense, I would say, is a 2 to 4 hour read, depending on how fast you read. I would say the crisis papers are anywhere from a 10 to 15, 18 hour read, again, depending on how fast you read. So I think crisis papers might even need to be 1 or even 2 other sessions to go through, but we'll get through. I'm very hopeful we'll get through the best extracts from Common Sense for a little inspiration for many of the ills that plague society these days. So Common Sense is divided into 4 parts, and then there's also an introduction, which we'll go through here. And so I don't want to do all the reading. I've read a lot of Thomas Paine in preparation for this, so if anybody else wants to read, maybe
there's about 4 people, Sam, that have volunteered, if you look in the chat.
Fantastic. So why don't we all take turns reading for 5 or 10 minutes each?
Sam, in my experience, you're going to have to be the maestro directing who reads, though. So if you could see the chat, Or Magdalena. Actually, Magdalena, why don't you do that? So you just pull people out who volunteered and just call upon them to read accordingly. Otherwise,
Okay.
it gets kind of like it disjointed.
Okay. Bruce will start.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
All righty.
Now we just need the words.
The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. Many circumstances hath and will arise which are not local, but universal, and through which the principles of all lovers of mankind are affected, and in the event of which their affections are interested. The laying a country desolate with fire and sword, declaring war against the natural rights of all mankind, and extirpating the defenders thereof from the face of the earth, is the concern of every man to whom nature hath given the power of feeling, of which class, regardless of party censure, is the author.
Next.
P.S. The publication of this new edition hath been delayed with a view of taking notice, had it been necessary, of any attempt to refute the doctrine of independence. As no answer hath yet appeared, it is now presumed that none will, the time needful for getting such a performance ready for the public being considerably past. Who the author of this production is wholly unnecessary to the public, as the object for attention is the doctrine itself, not the man. Yet it may not be unnecessary to say that he is unconnected with any party and under no sort of influence, public or private, but the influence of reason and principle. Philadelphia, February 14th, 1776. Of the origin and design of government in general, with concise remarks on the English Constitution. Some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. The former promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections, the latter negatively by restraining our vices. The one encourages intercourse, the other creates distinctions. The first a patron, the last a punisher. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. For when we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without government, our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. Government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. The palaces of kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise. For were the impulses of conscience clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, man would need no other lawgiver. But that not being the case, he finds it necessary to surrender up a part of his property to furnish means for the protection of the rest. And this he is induced to do by the same prudence which, in every other case, advises him out of two evils to choose the least. I draw my idea of the form of government from a principle in nature, which no art can overturn, viz. I'll practice that the more simple anything is, the less liable it is to be disordered, and the easier repaired when disordered. And with this maxim in view, I offer a few remarks on the so much boasted Constitution of England. That it was noble for the dark and slavish times in which it was erected is granted. When the world was overrun with tyranny, the least remove therefrom was a glorious rescue. But that it is imperfect, subject to convulsions, and incapable of producing what it seems to promise is easily demonstrated.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We'll run into viz a couple of times. Just letting everybody know, viz is an old-timey English word that means either namely or in other words.
Thank you.
I had to look it up when I was going through this.
I'm embarrassed to say I've encountered that for years and years, and it's only now that I've gotten a satisfying reason for why it exists. Thank you.
I love it. Absolute governments, though the disgrace of human nature, have this advantage with them, that they are simple. If the people suffer, they know the head from which their suffering springs, know likewise the remedy, and are not bewildered by a variety of causes and cures. But the Constitution of England is so exceedingly complex that the nation may suffer for years together without being able to discover in which part the fault lies. Some will say in one and some in another, and every political physician will advise a different medicine. I know it is difficult to get over local or long-standing prejudices, yet if we will suffer ourselves to examine the component parts of the English Constitution, we shall find them to be the base remains of two ancient tyrannies, compounded with some new republican materials. First, the remains of monarchical tyranny in the person of the king. Secondly, the remains of aristocratical tyranny in the persons of the peers. Third, the new republican materials in the persons of the commons, on whose virtue depends the freedom of England. The two first, by being hereditary, are independent of the people. Wherefore, in a constitutional sense, they contribute nothing towards the freedom of the state. To say that the Constitution of England is a union of three powers reciprocally checking each other is farcical. Either the words have no meaning or they are flat contradictions. To say that the Commons is a check upon the king presupposes two things. First, that the king is not to be trusted without being looked after, or in other words, that a thirst for absolute power is the natural disease of monarchy. Secondly, that the commons, by being appointed for that purpose, are either wiser or more worthy of confidence than the crown. But as the same constitution, which gives the commons a power to check the king by withholding the supplies, gives afterwards the king a power to check the commons by empowering him to reject their other bills, it again supposes that the king is wiser than those whom it has already supposed to be wiser than him, a mere absurdity. There is something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. It first excludes a man from the means of information, yet empowers him to act in cases where the highest judgment is required. The state of a king shuts him from the world, yet the business of a king requires him to know it thoroughly. Wherefore, the different parts, by unnaturally opposing and destroying each other, prove the whole character to be absurd and useless. Some writers have explained the English Constitution thus: the king, say they, is one, the people another. The peers are in a house in behalf of the king, the commons in behalf of the people. But this hath all the distinctions of a house divided against itself. How came the king by a power which the people are afraid to trust and always obliged to check? Such a power could not be the gift of a wise people. Neither can any power which needs checking be from God, yet the provision which the Constitution makes supposes such a power to exist. The prejudice of Englishmen in favor of their own government by kings, lords, and commons arises as much or more from national pride than reason. Individuals are undoubtedly safer in England than in some other countries, but the will of the king is as much the law of the land in Britain as in France, with this difference that instead of proceeding directly from his mouth, it is handed to the people under the more formidable shape of an act of parliament. For the fate of Charles I hath only made kings more subtle, not more just. Wherefore, laying aside all national pride and prejudice in favor of modes and forms, The plain truth is that it is wholly owing to the constitution of the people and not to the constitution of the government that the crown is not as oppressive in England as in Turkey. An inquiry into the constitutional errors in the English form of government is at this time highly necessary, for as we are never in a proper condition of doing justice to others while we continue under the influence of some leading partiality, so neither are we capable of doing it to ourselves while we remain fettered by any obstinate prejudice. And as a man who is attached to a prostitute is unfitted to choose or judge of a wife, so any prepossession in favor of a rotten constitution of government will disable us from discerning a good one.
Bruce, did you want to continue or are you getting tired?
I'm just getting warmed up.
Oh, okay, go for it.
You tell me, you get the cane and pull me off stage when you want. But there's another and greater distinction for which no truly natural or religious reason can be assigned, and that is the distinction of men into kings and subjects. Male and female are the distinctions of nature, good and bad, the distinctions of heaven. But how a race of men came into the world so exalted above the rest and distinguished like some new species is worth inquiring into, and whether they are the means of happiness or of misery to mankind. Government by kings was first introduced into the world by the heathens, from whom the children of Israel copied the custom. It was the most prosperous invention the devil ever set on foot for the promotion of idolatry. The heathens paid divine honors to their deceased kings, and the Christian world hath improved on the plan by doing the same to their living ones. How impious is the title of sacred majesty applied to a worm who in the midst of his splendor is crumbling into dust. Near 3,000 years passed away from the Mosaic account of the creation till the Jews, under a national delusion, requested a king. Till then, their form of government, except in extraordinary cases where the Almighty interposed, was a kind of republic administered by a judge and the elders of the tribes. Kings they had none, and it was held sinful to acknowledge any being under that title but the Lord of hosts. And when a man seriously reflects on the idolatrous homage which is paid to the persons of kings, he need not wonder that the Almighty, ever jealous of his honor, should disapprove of a form of government which so impiously invades the prerogative of heaven. Monarchy is ranked in Scripture as one of the sins of the Jews, for which a curse and reserve is denounced against them. The history of that transaction is worth attending to. The children of Israel being oppressed by the Midianites, Gideon marched against them with a small army, and victory through the divine interposition decided in his favor. The Jews, elate with success and attributing it to the generalship of Gideon, proposed making him a king, saying, "Rule thou over us, thou and thy son and thy son's son." Here was temptation in its fullest extent. Not a kingdom only, but an hereditary one. But Gideon, in the piety of his soul, replied, "I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." Words need not be more explicit. Gideon doth not decline the honor, but denieth their right to give it. Neither doth he compliment them with invented declarations of his thanks, but in the positive style of a prophet charges them with disaffection to their proper sovereign, the King of heaven. About 130 years after this, they fell again into the same error. The hankering which the Jews had for the idolatrous customs of the heathens is something exceedingly unaccountable. But so it was, that laying hold of the misconduct of Samuel's two sons, who were entrusted with some secular concerns, they came in an abrupt and clamorous manner to Samuel, saying, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all other nations. And here we cannot but observe that their motives were bad, that they might be like other nations, that is, the heathens, whereas their true glory laid in being as much unlike them as possible. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord, and the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king, and he said, This shall be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. This describes the expense and luxury, as well as the oppression of kings. And he will take your fields and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your feed and of your vineyards, and give them to his officers and to his servants, by which we see that bribery, corruption, and favoritism are the standing vices of kings. And he will take the tenth of your men servants, and your maid servants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to work. And you will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And you shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So Samuel called unto the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And all the people said unto Samuel, Pray for thy servants unto the Lord thy God, that we die not, for we have added unto our sins this evil, to ask a king. These portions of Scripture are direct and positive. They admit of no equivocal construction. That the Almighty hath here entered his protest against monarchical government is true, or the Scripture is false.
So I'm just going to interrupt 1 second, because during this time, a lot of pamphleteers and people who were advocating politically in America were lawyers and people who were making very high-minded arguments, writing in Latin and things like this. And Thomas Paine, using only plain English and basic scripture and the book of prayer, which almost all Americans had access to, that's the entirety of what he used to make all his arguments in this book, including this like very interesting religious argument against kings. And I just wanted to point that out, as it was quite important for how popular common sense became. Continue, Bruce.
Excellent, thank you. To the evil.
Oh, sorry.
Did I read that part?
No.
To the evil of monarchy, we have added that of hereditary succession. And as the first is a degradation and lessening of ourselves, so the second, claimed as a matter of right, is an insult and an imposition on posterity. For all men being originally equals, no one by birth could have a right to set up his own family in perpetual preference to all others forever. And though himself might deserve some decent degree of honors of his contemporaries, yet his descendants might be far too unworthy to inherit them. The nearer any government approaches to a republic, the less business there is for a king. It is somewhat difficult to find a proper name for the government of England. Sir William Meredith calls it a republic, but in its present state, it is unworthy of the name because of the corrupt influence of the crown, by having all the places in its disposal, hath so effectually swallowed up the power and eaten out the virtue of the House of Commons, the Republican part in the Constitution, that the government of England is nearly as monarchical as that of France or Spain. Men fall out with names without understanding them. For it is the republican and not the monarchical part of the Constitution of England which Englishmen glory in, viz., the liberty of choosing a House of Commons from out of their own body. And it is easy to see that when republican virtue fails, slavery ensues. Why is the Constitution of England sickly? But because monarchy hath poisoned the republic, the crown hath engrossed the commons. In England, a king hath little more to do than to make war and give away places, which in plain terms is to impoverish the nation and set it together by the ears. A pretty business indeed for a man to be allowed 800,000 sterling a year for and worshipped into the bargain. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Thoughts on the present state of American affairs?
Do you have any remarks, Sam, or do we just go straight forward into the next section?
Well, so that was the end of part 2. So as I said, Common Sense is divided up into 4 parts. And yeah, that was part 2. I think we missed the title page, but that was on monarchy and hereditary succession, where he's arguing against the nature of monarchy and hereditary succession using what I found to be kind of novel arguments, some of it, taken from scripture, which caused a huge stir at the time. Obviously now it would be a bit more accepted, except for unfortunately still in England, where they continue with their hereditary succession with our new King Charles III. But most places on earth have abandoned this remnant of feudalism. So now we move on to part 3, thoughts on the present state of American affairs.
And we have somebody else reading for change. Jerry, you want to do it?
Yeah.
Jerry?
Yes, ma'am, I can do it.
Okay.
Bruce, you did a fantastic job, though.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
We get back to you again. Don't worry. Don't relax.
Okay, but I'll mute.
Thoughts on the present state of American affairs. In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. Volumes have been written on the subject of the struggle between England and America. Men of all ranks have embarked in the controversy from different motives and with various designs. But all have been ineffectual, and the period of debate is closed. Arms, as the last resort, decide the contest. The appeal was the choice of the king, and the continent hath accepted the challenge. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now. Now is the seed time of continental union, faith, and honor. The least fracture now will be like a name engraved with the point of a pin on the tender rind of a young oak. The wound will enlarge with the tree, and posterity read it in full-grown characters. I have heard it asserted by some that as America hath flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, that the same connection is necessary towards her future happiness and will always have the same effect. Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. But even this is admitting more than is true, for I answer roundly that America would have flourished as much and probably much more had no European power had anything to do with her. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, and will always have a market, while eating is the custom of Europe. But she has protected us, some say. That she has engrossed us is true, and defended the continent at our expense as well as her own is admitted. And she would have defended Turkey from the same motive, viz., the sake of trade and dominion. Alas, we have been long led away by ancient prejudices and made large sacrifices to superstition. We have boasted the protection of Great Britain without considering that her motive was interest, not attachment, that she did not protect us from our enemies on our account, but from her enemies on her own account, from those who had no quarrel with us on any other account, and who will always be our enemies on the same account. Well, let Britain waive her pretensions to the continent, or the continent throw off the dependence, and we should be at peace with France and Spain were they at war with Britain. The miseries of Hanover last war ought to warn us against connections. But Britain is the parent country, say some. Then the more shame upon her conduct. Even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their families. Europe, and not England, is the parent country of America. This new world hath been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe. Hither have they fled, not from the tender embraces of the mother, but from the cruelty of the monster. And it is so far true of England that the same tyranny which drove the first emigrants from home pursues their descendants still. Besides, what have we to do with setting the world at defiance? Our plan is commerce, and that, well attended to, will secure us the peace and friendship of all Europe, because it is the interest of all Europe to have America a free port. Her trade will always be a protection, and her barrenness of gold and silver secure her from invaders. I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge. Not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its price in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for by them where we will. But the injuries and disadvantages we sustain by that connection are without number. And our duty to mankind at large, as well as to ourselves, instruct us to renounce the alliance, because any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and sets us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship. and against whom we have neither anger nor complaint. As Europe is our market for trade, we ought to form no partial connection with any part of it. It is the true interest of America to steer clear of European contentions, which she never can do while her dependence on Britain, she is made the make weight in the scale of British politics.
We see sort of an echoing of George Washington's farewell address years later, where he warned of entangling alliances.
Yes, of neutrality. But the injuries and disadvantage we sustain, hang on.
You read
This is
that
the
already,
correct
Jerry.
slide here. Yeah.
Oh,
Yes,
okay, I'm
yes.
sorry. I'm on a roll, I just don't stop. Europe is too thickly planted with kingdoms to be long at peace, and whenever a war breaks out between England and any foreign power, the trade of America goes to ruin because of her connection with Britain. Everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." Even the distance at which the Almighty hath placed England and America is a strong and natural proof that the authority of the one over the other was never the design of heaven. The object contended for ought always to bear some just proportion to the expense. The removal of North, or the whole detestable junto, is a matter unworthy the millions we have expended. A temporary stoppage of trade was an inconvenience, which would have sufficiently balanced the repeal of all the acts complained of, had such repeals been obtained. But if the whole continent must take up arms, if every man must be a soldier, it is scarcely worth our while to fight against a contemptible ministry only. The powers of governing still remaining in the hands of the king, he will have a negative over the whole legislation of this continent. And as he has shown himself such an inveterate enemy to liberty, and discovered such a thirst for arbitrary power, is he or is he not a proper man to say to these colonies, "You shall make no laws but what I please"? After matters are made up, as it is called, can there be any doubt but the whole power of the crown will be exerted to keep this continent as low and humble as possible? Instead of going forward, we shall go backward, or be perpetually quarreling or ridiculously petitioning. We are already greater than the king wishes us to be, and will he not hereafter endeavor to make us less? If there is any true cause of fear respecting independence, it is because no plan is yet laid down. Men do not see their way out. Wherefore, as an opening into that business, I offer the following hints. Let the assemblies be annual, with a president only, the representation more equal, their business wholly domestic and subject to the authority of a continental Congress. Let each colony be divided into 6, 8, or 10 convenient districts, each district to send a proper number of delegates to the Congress, so that each colony send at least 30. The whole number in Congress will be at least 390. Each Congress to sit and to choose a president. And in order that nothing may pass into a law but what is satisfactorily just, not less than 3/5 of the Congress to be called a majority. He that will promote discord under a government so equally formed as this would have joined Lucifer in his revolt.
So just two things that I wanted to point out here. The first is how much what he was calling for, like a continental Congress, and he called it charter, but like a constitution, eventually came to pass. And also, when I was talking earlier about John Adams and the issues he had with Thomas Paine and common sense, that was exactly what it was. That we now think of John Adams as this like democratic founding father, but at the time he was actually against everything that Thomas Paine is proposing here in this democratic form of government.
Yes. And it's interesting, he calls for a Continental Congress, which is what their first kind of assembly was called.
Exactly.
And also the army. It was called the Continental Army.
That's right.
Yeah, very interesting. But as there is a peculiar delicacy from whom or in what manner this business must first arise, and as it seems most agreeable and consistent that it should come from some intermediate body between the governed and the governors, that is, between the Congress and the people, let a continental conference be held in the following manner and for the following purpose. The conferring members being met, let their business be to frame a continental charter or charter of the United Colonies, answering to what is called the Magna Carta of England, fixing the number and manner of choosing members of Congress, members of Assembly, with their date of sitting, and drawing the line of business and jurisdiction between them. Always remembering that our strength is continental, not provincial. Securing freedom and property to all men, and above all things, the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, with such other matter as is necessary for a charter to contain. Immediately after which, the said conference to dissolve, and the bodies which shall be chosen conformable to the said charter to be the legislators and governors of this continent for the time being, whose peace and happiness may God preserve. Amen.
So so we see number one, calling for like a strong federal government, sort of Hamiltonian style, saying that our strength is continental, not provincial, and also he was strongly anti-slavery, as was Ben Franklin, calling for freedom for all men. His choice of words there was very on purpose.
Yes. And another point, when he meant continent, he meant continent. Even Canada was invited to come to the conference.
Yes, and of course we failed Ben Franklin's challenge, as Matt has written.
Susan, would you like to continue?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Should any body of men be hereafter delegated for this or some similar purpose, I offer them the following extracts from that wise observer on government's Dragonetti. The science, says he, of the politician consists in fixing the true point of happiness and freedom. Those men would deserve the gratitude of ages who should discover a mode of government that contained the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense. But where, says some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above and does not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Britain. Yet that we may not appear to be defective even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king. For as in absolute governments, the king is law, so in free countries, the law ought to be king. A government of our own is our natural right. And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in a cool, deliberate manner while we have it in our power than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind.
So that was the end of part 3. And now we'll move on to the fourth and final section of Common Sense of the Presentability of America, with some miscellaneous reflections, where he is going to go through his advocacy for building up of industry, and with a focus on a navy for countering the navy of Great Britain.
Did you want me to continue?
Yes, absolutely.
It is not in numbers, but in unity that our great strength lies. Yet our present numbers are sufficient to repel the force of all the world. The continent hath at this time the largest body of armed and disciplined men of any power under heaven, and is just arrived at that pitch of strength in which no single colony is able to support itself, and the whole, when united, can accomplish the matter, and either more or less than this might be fatal in its effects. Our land force is already sufficient, and as to naval affairs, we cannot be insensible that Britain would never suffer an American man of war to be built while the continent remained in her hands. Debts we have none, and whatever we may contract on this account will serve as a glorious memento of our virtue. Can we but leave posterity with a settled form of government, an independent constitution of its own, the purchase at any price will be cheap. But to expend millions for the sake of getting a few vile acts repealed and routing the present ministry only is unworthy the charge, and is using posterity with the utmost cruelty, because it is leaving them the great work to do, and a debt upon their backs from which they derive no advantage. The debt we may contract does not deserve our regard if the work be but accomplished. No nation ought to be without a debt. A national debt is a national bond, and when it bears no interest, it is in no case a grievance. Britain is oppressed with a debt of upwards of 140 millions sterling, for which she pays upwards of 4 millions interest. And as a compensation for her debt, she has a large navy. America is without a debt and without a navy, yet for the 20th part of the English national debt, could have a navy as large again. The Navy of England is not worth at this time more than 3.5 millions sterling. No country on the globe is so happily situated or so internally capable of raising a fleet as America. Tar, timber, iron, and cordage are her natural produce. We need go abroad for nothing, whereas the Dutch, who make large profits by hiring out their ships of war to the Spaniards and Portuguese, are obliged to import most of the materials they use. We ought to view the building of a fleet as an article of commerce, it being the natural manufactory of this country. It is the best money we can lay out. A navy, when finished, is worth more than it cost, and is that nice point in national policy in which commerce and protection are united. Let us build. If we want them not, we can sell, and by that means replace our paper currency with ready gold and silver. In point of safety, ought we to be without a fleet? We are not the little people now, which we were 60 years ago. At that time, we might have trusted our property in the streets, or fields rather, and slept securely without locks or bolts to our doors or windows. The case now is altered, and our methods of defense ought to improve with our increase of property. A common pirate 12 months ago might have come up the Delaware and laid the city of Philadelphia under instant contribution, but for what sum he pleased. And the same might have happened to other places. Nay, any daring fellow in a brig of 14 or 16 guns might have robbed the whole continent and carried off 500,000 of money. These are circumstances which demand our attention and point out the necessity of naval protection. Some perhaps will say that after we have made it up with Britain, she will protect us. Can we be so unwise as to mean that she shall keep a navy in our harbors for that purpose? Common sense will tell us that the power which hath endeavored to subdue us is of all others the most improper to defend us. To unite the sinews of commerce and defense is sound policy, for when our strength and our riches play into each other's hands, we need fear no external enemy. In almost every article of defense we abound. Hemp flourishes even to rankness, so that we need not want cordage. Our iron is superior to that of other countries. Our small arms equal to any in the world. Cannon we can cast at pleasure. Saltpeter and gunpowder we are every day producing. Our knowledge is hourly improving. Resolution is our inherent character, and courage hath never yet forsaken us. Wherefore, what is it that we want? Why is it that we hesitate? From Britain, we can expect nothing but ruin. If she is once admitted to the government of America again, this continent will not be worth living in. Jealousies will be always arising. Insurrections will be constantly happening, and who will go forth to quell them? Who will venture his life to reduce his own countrymen to a foreign obedience? The difference between Pennsylvania and Connecticut, respecting some unlocated lands, shows the insignificance of a British government and fully proves that nothing but continental authority can regulate continental matters. Youth is the seed time of good habits, as well in nations as in individuals. It might be difficult, if not impossible, to form the continent into one government half a century hence. The vast variety of interests occasioned by an increase of trade and population would create confusion. Colony would be against colony, each being able might scorn each other's assistance. And while the proud and foolish gloried in their little distinctions, the wise would lament that the Union had not been formed before. Wherefore, the present time is the true time for establishing it. The intimacy which is contracted in infancy and the friendship which is formed in misfortune are, of all others, the more lasting and unalterable. Our present union is marked with both these characters. We are young and we have been distressed, but our concord hath withstood our troubles and fixes a memorable area for posterity to glory in.
Thank you, Susan. Bruce, could you go on again?
Yes, indeed. As to religion, I hold it to be the indispensable duty of all government to protect all conscientious professors thereof. And I know of no other business which government hath to do therewith. For myself, I fully and conscientiously believe that it is the will of the Almighty that there should be diversity of religious opinions among us. It affords a larger field for our Christian kindness. Were we all of one way of thinking, our religious dispositions would want matter for probation. And on this liberal principle, I look on the various denominations among us to be like children of the same family, differing only in what is called their Christian names. To conclude, however strange it may appear to some, or however unwilling they may be to think so, matters not. But many strong and striking reasons may be given to show that nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration for independence. Some of which are, first, it is the custom of nations, when any two are at war, for some other powers not engaged in the quarrel to step in as mediators and bring about the preliminaries of a peace. But while America calls herself the subject of Great Britain, no power, however well disposed she may be, can offer her mediation. Wherefore, in our present state, we may quarrel on forever. Secondly, it is unreasonable to suppose that France or Spain will give us any kind of assistance if we mean only to make use of that assistance for the purpose of repairing the breach and strengthening the connection between Britain and America, because those powers would be sufferers by the consequences. Thirdly, while we profess ourselves the subjects of Britain, we must, in the eye of foreign nations, be considered as rebels. The precedent is somewhat dangerous to their peace for men to be in arms under the name of subjects. We, on the spot, can solve the paradox, but to unite resistance and subjection requires an idea much too refined for common understanding. Fourthly, were a manifesto to be published and dispatched to foreign courts, setting forth the miseries we have endured and the peaceable methods we have ineffectually used for redress, declaring at the same time that, not being able any longer to live happily or safely under the cruel disposition of the British court, we had been driven to the necessity of breaking off all connections with her, at the same time assuring all such courts of our peaceable disposition towards them and of our desire of entering into trade with them. Such a memorial would produce more good effects to this continent than if a ship were freighted with petitions to Britain.
So we saw at the beginning, this was February 1776, and just 5 months later, July 4th, 1776, that manifesto was published, indeed, the Declaration of Independence.
That's extremely valuable. I had always believed that this was written after the Declaration of Independence, and that's silly because I'd actually read this. It didn't connect in my mind that this is a call to make the Declaration of Independence a reality. Interesting.
Yeah, and what he's saying in part 3, where he says that if we're subjects of Britain, then we're just rebels. That was also Abraham Lincoln's argument for, like, if they recognize the Confederacy. And Abraham Lincoln played a very precarious legal game throughout the whole Civil War, because they were at one hand engaging with them in war, but at the same time they couldn't acknowledge them, and they fought to prevent any countries from recognizing the Confederacy, because then they would, be given legitimacy in the eyes of four nations. Four nations would have been allowed to help them. So Thomas Paine is making the same argument here, that unless we declare independence, we are just rebellious subjects, and no other foreign country will come and help us.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Under our present denomination of British subjects, we can neither be received nor heard abroad. The custom of all courts is against us, and will be so until by an independence we take rank with other nations. These proceedings may at first appear strange and difficult, but like all other steps which we have already passed over, will in a little time become familiar and agreeable. And until an independence is declared, the continent will feel itself like a man who continues putting off some unpleasant business from day to day, yet knows it must be done, hates to set about it, wishes it over, and is continually haunted with the thoughts of its necessity.
So that is the conclusion of common sense. And so I think maybe we can just do a couple of the beginnings of crisis papers, and then maybe end it here. So what happened is that Declaration of Independence comes, and the war with Britain accelerates and intensifies, and then during the winter, the American army, the Continental Army, is not doing very well, and George Washington and the army are holed up at Valley Forge for the winter, and Thomas Paine publishes in December, right near Christmas, 1776, the first crisis paper. So there was 13 of these pamphlets published in total. Most of them were published in 1776 and 1777, and there was 3 additional ones published between 1777 and 1783. And so the first crisis pamphlet opens with the very now iconic words, "These are the times that try men's souls." If you want, you can move the slide forward. And the very last crisis paper in 1783 begins, "The times that try men's souls are over." So during the whole publishing of the crisis papers, the Revolutionary War takes place. So these are very stirring words, the beginning of Crisis 1, that have now become iconic, and maybe you have heard them before and you weren't even sure where you've heard them. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then there is not such a thing as slavery upon earth. Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. And we can end here on this last part in the opening of Crisis 1. Matt, you published an article recently making an excellent point about Naomi Klein, who wrote a book on crisis capitalism and how they exploit crises to push forward their agenda now. And it seems like we live in an age of like rule by crisis, but that she doesn't realize that the same applies to the climate crisis. Like she buys into that one. But you know, having just come out of the COVID panic and everything, the next part is quite I think holds a lot of portent for the age we're living in today, and I think is fairly universal for how tyrants in general rule. It is surprising to see how rapidly a panic will sometimes run through a country. All nations and ages have been subject to them. Yet panics in some cases have their uses. They produce as much good as hurt. Their duration is always short. The mind soon grows through them and acquires a firmer habit than before. But their peculiar advantage is that they are the touchstones of sincerity and hypocrisy, and bring things and men to light which might otherwise have lain forever undiscovered. In fact, they have the same effect on secret traitors which an imaginary apparition would have upon a private murderer. They sift out the hidden thoughts of men and hold them up in public to the world. And many a disguised Tory has lately shown his head. And this was read, George Washington ordered the Crisis 1 read to the troops assembled at Valley Forge. And it produced a great stirring effect upon them. It was a great inspiration to the Continental Army during their biggest time of crisis.
Thank you, Sam. That was really powerful because I actually never had read the papers by myself. So a lot of insight. So Jerry had a comment. Jerry?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. It's so amazing to read it now because I read it years and years and years ago, so I don't really remember, but it's everything in common sense is really what the colonies did, you know, calling for a continental conference, all of this. But I know you mentioned earlier that some people said that Franklin wrote it and not Paine. I know that Franklin was the one who asked Thomas Paine to write it, but the more you read it, I just see Benjamin Franklin there. It's his ideas. I mean, I'm sure he and Paine must have talked this over. There had to be some kind of collaboration, and then Paine sat down and wrote it. But I just wanted to know if you could comment on that, what your thinking is on that too.
I know that Dr. Benjamin Rush talked with Thomas Paine about the utility of such a pamphlet of encouraging independence, because there was a great deal of public opinion at the time of reconciliation with Britain, and they wanted to move the public mind. And Thomas Paine immediately set out upon that task, writing common sense. But you're right. I mean, there's one part in it where he's talking about, you know, the only legitimate aim of government is to I can't remember the exact words, but like produce the most happiness for its citizens for the least expense. And I mean, if you remember the talk on Leibniz and natural law and Vattel and the influence of Vattel and how much Vattel had influenced people like Ben Franklin and Hamilton, that you really do see it does sound a lot like Ben Franklin in a number of points. And they were great friends and political allies that agreed on a whole lot of things politically.
Could you quickly say who Dr. Benjamin Rush is?
Well, he was another one of the founding fathers. I don't remember from which state he was, but he was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you. Bruce, you had a comment and a question?
How applicable this history is, how urgent it is for everyone who can to teach everyone that we can, how today we are continuing hopefully the never-ending story, you know, until the nukes fly, it's the never-ending story of the struggle for freedom and the struggle for the existence, the creation of a government that will serve its people and protect its people. And my question to Sam is, do you publish and post on a regular basis anywhere like Substack, or where can I follow you, Sam?
I don't know. I've been a friend of Matt's for a long time, and I have a history degree. I'm an engineer as well, so I have a full-time job. I have 3 small children, so I don't have a lot of time. But I do like to support Matt however I can. I'm very proud to call Matt a friend. I'm proud of just seeing everything that he's doing, and if I can, you know, participate in any way. Occasionally he reaches out asking if I'd like to, you know, put together a talk, and it's always my great honor to do so. Maybe I should start a Substack. I don't have one right now. No, I don't have a YouTube channel or anything like that. I definitely agree with what you just said, and the one criticism I would say of Thomas Paine is that he focuses entirely on getting rid of monarchy, but as Matt and I focus on a lot, the great evil that mankind faces in getting rid of, that's so difficult to get rid of, is oligarchy, not necessarily monarchy. And how do you produce a citizenry educated enough and developed enough to be intelligent enough to finally eliminate the scourge of oligarchy from the face of the earth? It's really an evil as old as civilization itself. And as Plato said, it's the most difficult form of government to remove because it becomes the most deepest ingrained.
Yes, and only because I've read and discussed so much history and have gotten a turbocharge of history from discovering Matt and Cynthia and the Rising Tide Foundation over the last couple of years, like amping it up, you know, on steroids. Am I able to stay calm and cheerful and hopeful to know this is the same as it ever was? As bad as it seems, you know, folks with less knowledge of history might think, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The noose is so tight around our necks. The next move is just going to lock us down, if not blow up half the world. And yet, when you know history, you see that the contemporary commentary sounds like what I just said. It's never been so bad. It can't possibly. We're at the freaking brink. to arms, and then it's awful when the passions take to the streets. Not that those aren't interesting turning points when they're necessary, but thank you very much for your effort today, Sam, in bringing this to us, really.
Thank you for your great reading.
Thanks, Bruce. Adria has her hand up. Okay, Adria, you there?
I am. Thank you so much. I wanted to know what your thoughts were with respect to his atheism. He was pretty adamant atheist, and he did write on the Masons, but I don't know if you know whether or not he was a Mason. I don't know that is known. I have not read his essay on the Masons, but we do know that Ben Franklin was the Grand Master of one of the most legendary Masonic halls in Paris. And we do know that George Washington was also a Mason, and that the Declaration of Independence, which, as we all kind of noted, was the entire impetus to declare independence was from common sense. That was written on, if I am not mistaken, on a Masonic apron, on the parchment of a Masonic apron. So to what extent are you aware of the atheist and or Masonic roots that informs this ideology of Paine and his followers?
Great question. So I'll start with the atheism. He wrote late in life a work called The Age of Reason, where he was promoting deism. So a belief in a supreme being outside of Christianity or any other organized religion, where he was attacking all forms of organized religion. And he submitted the manuscript to Ben Franklin, who advised him not to publish it. And Ben Franklin himself is, I believe he was a deist as well. But he advised Thomas Paine, don't publish this. It will not do any good, and you will just ruin your life by publishing this. And he did not take Dr. Franklin's advice, and he published The Age of Reason. And as Dr. Franklin said, Thomas Paine's reputation was ruined. When he died, no graveyard would take his coffin. Nobody would allow Thomas Paine, the writer of The Age of Reason, to be buried in their graveyard. So he published The Age of Reason to a great detriment to himself personally. And Thomas Paine, it's a really tragic life. He went to France after the revolution and tried to fight alongside in what is now called the Girondin faction against the Jacobins. And he was imprisoned during the French Revolution after the storming of the Bastille, which we now know was a British operation, the Jacobins themselves, run out of the Duke of Orleans' home, who was a British agent. And the Masonry, I'm actually been working on something related to this. I haven't come out with it yet, but first of all, there's a great chapter in Anton Chaikin's book, Treason in America, where he talks about the difference between Ben Franklin's Grand Orient Freemasonry versus the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And what we typically associate with like the evil of Freemasonry, like Albert Pike and the Satanism and all that, is typically the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which actually the British imported into America for the purpose of subverting America after they lost the War of 1812. And so I'm working on something like this. I hope to have a presentation for Matt sometime probably towards the end of this year, which will be very sweeping in scope in terms of his history, but will have a large part of it devoted to this history of the Scottish Rite, and its creation at the hands of the British, its involvement in the Confederacy and the attempts to break up the Union. But for now, I would say, if you want to learn more about it, check out Anton Chaikin's book, Treason in America, and especially that chapter.
Sam, could you add a quick epilogue to this, in this current research you're doing? What have you found about the Illuminati and its infiltration of the Masons and its potential spawning of the Order of Skull and Bones at Yale in 1832, if anything, and briefly if you want?
I don't have anything like on Adam Weishaupt, the Illuminati. So I haven't gone as far as Skull and Bones yet, although I'm certainly familiar with Skull and Bones. I don't know intimately the history of Skull and Bones, how it came to be, or if there is any association with the Illuminati. It's my understanding that a lot of the mythos behind the Illuminati comes from this British guy, Scottish guy, John Robison, who published this book what's it called? A plot or something against all governments in Europe, and that itself was. See, I'm talking out of school here because I don't have my notes in front of me and I can't remember exactly, but there was a lot of issues with the guy John Robison himself, the Scot, who published this book that's kind of a sophistry. And yeah, I don't have my notes in front of me about John Robison, but I know that, again, Anton Chaikin has dealt with that question, and I was reading some stuff that he did on it, and I would suggest maybe searching the archives of EIR. There's a lot of good stuff on John Robison and the Illuminati question as well.
EIR, what's that?
Executive Intelligence Review. It's where people like Jeff Steinberg and Anton Chaikin wrote for decades. It's larouchepub.com/search.html. You can search the archives going back to 1976, I believe, maybe even a bit earlier.
Yeah, definitely lots of research there. Also, New Federalist Centerfolds, what they call New Federalist Almanac, has a number of things like that. I'm having a number of people having their hands raised. Steve will be next, and then Helen, and then Warren Monty. Please.
Thanks, Magdalena. Thanks, Sam. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to get back to some of the earlier readings on common sense and how the principles that Paine was illuminating, he understood as not being American, but truly universal. And if we, sort of take that thing where they're the kind of birthright of everyone across the planet, and then we kind of layer in Bruce's positive ideas of understanding history and how we keep morale up and see things in perspective. I just wanted to point out that, we all have capacity to be activists in a very benevolent way and take the knowledge that we gain via these lectures, via Rising Tides, via all the articles that Matt and Cynthia have written and others. And you can contest disinformation and propaganda on social media very civilly and politely, and just, take excerpts from articles, quotes, and then link and help set the record straight. And I've seen that going on. And even though it's a humble action, when you think back to the Continental Army, there was a collection of individual soldiers. And if we start doing that and start not only seeking the truth, but using it to enlighten others, I think we can have small but discernible effects. And you never know when you cast a pebble and you can start an avalanche at some point.
totally agree, Stephen. So much of our trouble today stems from the fact that people are not engaged and are not involved. And so much of our war is a culture war. And I mean, I think that's why Matt and Cynthia are so valuable, because it's really about education and getting people active. Unfortunately, what's in vogue today is not activism. It's watching TV or scrolling on your phone. And the powers that be love that, because when you're doing that, you're not engaged, you're not active, and you're not a threat of any kind.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all have it within our power to make small contributions, but what we learned here. So I guess I just put the plug in to not only learn and think, but to some extent do something with the knowledge.
Thank you, Stephen. Helen, are you there?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Sam. It was terrific. I just wanted to make a recommendation. I thought that this book was a good backdrop to, and of course, Matt recommended this book. This is How the Nation Was Won, and this is by H. Graham Lowry, and maybe many of you have read it, but I thought it was a fantastic book, and it's a good backdrop. That's all.
It is a phenomenal book. I've definitely read it. I have my own copy. I gave a talk for Rising Tide Foundation on the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was directly inspired by reading that book and realizing the untold story of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is told in that book. And getting back to what Bruce was saying earlier about how, it's like the same story all throughout history, that we think we have it so bad now. When I opened that talk, I made the exact same comment, that going through the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you see that like nothing has changed. We face the same evils and the same struggles today as they did hundreds of years ago back then.
Thank you, Sam. Monty, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Sam. Monty Cannell, I'm in Baja, Mexico. I've been associated with Matt for some time now, and been very interested. I inherited a series of books, 10-volume series from my father-in-law, The Life and Works of Thomas Paine. And in particular, I'll be referencing volume 5, The Letters and Dissertations of Thomas Paine. This was published in 1925. And I've been struggling with this question for a number of decades now, and really never saw it adequately addressed, and trying to position it in my own mind, given the fact that we've won a lot of wars militarily, but lost them politically. And in particular, I'd like to reference Thomas Paine's letters to James Monroe and George Washington during and immediately after his imprisonment in Luxembourg. Initially, Thomas Jefferson was the minister from the United States in France, and he was replaced by Governor Morris, who was a signer to the Constitution, but it appears that there was a secret instigation on the part of Governor Morris to have Thomas Paine imprisoned. And Thomas Paine addresses this in letters to Monroe and to Washington. And in particular, he was basically talking about the treachery of Washington and the betrayal of Washington. And so far as during this time, it appears that he was in prison. There were secret negotiations going on by John Jay with the British, which basically subjugated our Navy and our commerce. And this appears to be, there would have been an opportunity, I think, for a more favorable outcome with the French Revolution and in America. But it seems like somehow or other, Washington, at least according to the charges by Thomas Paine, fell into treachery insofar as relenting to the British, insofar as in particular the Jay Treaty and what came afterwards. And I know it's probably too much to address in this short time, but I would appreciate if perhaps in the future we could go a little more in depth on this subject as to what happened and why it happened. So if you could comment on that, please.
I can't comment on them because I haven't read them, but it does sound fascinating, and I agree I would love to in the future. Could you maybe post some of the example material that you're talking about in the chat, and I would love to check it out.
I'll do that.
Can I throw in a quick thought quickly?
Yes, of course.
Cool. Yeah, Sam, by the way, impeccable. Great. I really appreciate this whole presentation, and we should talk about maybe you leading a couple of readings of the crisis papers for some of the Wednesday night readings, since we're finishing our Kepler work pretty soon. So I think that would be a really nice follow-up, since Thomas Paine is really doing something like what Kepler does in his evaluation of all of the dominant theories of planetary motion and the different models that everyone had to sort of pay homage to, from Ptolemy and Tycho Brahe and Copernicus. And he dismantles them by showcasing how they're so convoluted that God would not create a creation that would be so unnecessarily complicated and self-contradictory, and then introduces, after dismantling or proving how these systems destroy themselves, he then introduces a system free of all of the core assumptions of the dominant standard theories. And that's exactly what Thomas Paine does in Common Sense. And I mean, the crisis papers don't exactly do that, but it really follows up nicely. So I think that would be a fun reading. If you'd be down for that, I'd be really game. The other thing on...
Definitely down for that. Yep.
Yeah, sweet. Thank you. And the other thing on your proposition for a class on the battles within Freemasonry, absolutely. That I've never seen that treated very well. I think Anton did some good work on that, but I haven't really seen anybody contemporary really treat that head on. So if at any time you want to do that, the platform is absolutely yours. I did share
well, you know the talk that I've been planning for some time now, that so it will feature quite prominently in that. It's part of that research. Absolutely. Yeah.
Good. That's good. Okay. I didn't realize that. That's great. And for those just here listening, I did post a really wonderful introductory essay by Lyndon LaRouche from 1978 on the secrets known only to the inner elites, which I think is just a great introduction to the battle, the nuance that's often missed of the battle within Freemasonic institutions over the millennia, regarding which has at its core two different cosmological worldviews of open and closed systems, of Aristotle versus Plato clashing, expressing itself at different times by people who utilize Freemasonic lodges to get things done, but that have different worldviews completely. And so LaRouche's essay is a really good intro, mixed with what Graham Lowry did in How the Nation Was Won together. I mean, I think, Adrian, anybody thinking on these lines, I think you're going to have a lot of your questions answered. And I also shared a paper by what's his name? Bob Ingram, who did a pretty good job in 2014 on an essay called Manhattan versus the Slave Power. Again, showcasing some nuance that's missed regarding what the lay of the land was that Jefferson and Thomas Paine didn't understand by the 1790s on the international stage, and that allowed them to get enmeshed in operations that had been completely controlled and dominated by Freemasonic operations of the worst variety in the French Revolution case, that they just never understood, and they didn't understand the nature of the battleground that higher quality thinkers like Ben Franklin and Hamilton, and I've even come to really respect John Jay and Morris more than I ever did before going into that. So that paper by Ingram is quite a good piece, Monty, for you to check out. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, and why don't we put that in the YouTube description as well for anybody watching this after? Because you're right, I've read that as well, and it is excellent.
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Sweet. That was it.
All
Magdalene,
right.
is there anyone else?
No, there wasn't.
Well, thank you,
Jerry
Matt.
kind of opened up
Uh,
a new thing here. He says on the chat, on that issue, I think Washington was right and Paine and Monroe were wrong. Do you have any comment, Jerry? Any more explanation?
Yeah, because I'm not familiar with this, so I would love to learn more.
Well, I mean, it goes down to the Jay Treaty, which even Washington himself said was not a good treaty, but then he said it's the best we're ever going to get from Britain. And I mean, the Senate voted for it, so it wasn't Washington imposing this on people, but there was, particularly you see it with Jefferson, who wanted the United States to ally with France, especially since France did help United States in the Revolutionary War. But Washington's policy was, we've just finished a war, the country's bankrupt, we have to have neutrality. We cannot get stuck in a war in Europe or we'll be there forever. So his policy that I think, Sam, you referred to in the common sense was this idea of neutrality. Neither ally with Britain or with France. And I think, I mean, it's a long story, but I'm trying to get at the basic. That was the problem. You know, I mean, Paine was in jail. He was pissed off. He wanted to get the hell out of there. And Washington wasn't going to sell the farm to get him out. And Monroe also, but they were part of this Jeffersonian faction that wanted to ally with France during the French Revolution. And Washington's policy was, no, we're strictly neutral. We can talk about being friends with France, but we will not form any alliances with other nations. And that was the big fight with the Jay Treaty, which a lot of people disagreed. Even Matthew Carey hated the Jay Treaty and broke from the Federalists and joined the Republicans with Jefferson, but he laterally went back. I mean, he always was a supporter of Hamilton, but the Jay Treaty was a big fight in the United States. So that's a whole other class you can do, Sam.
Well, I think I know a little bit about what you're talking about, and I do agree with Washington. They were wise to do what they did. We saw the debacle that was the French Revolution. I think that people like Thomas Paine, they put their money where their mouth was. He was over in France, and he was part of the faction that was like the pro-American, inspired by America faction with like the Marquis de Lafayette. But they had an operation run against them, the Jacobin faction, and the whole thing descended into chaos and, you know, bloodshed on an unimaginable scale that only ended with Napoleon, right? It brought Napoleon into power. So, I mean, they were very wise to stay out of it. And it's been a classical American principle of the best American leaders like John Quincy Adams. America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, that America stays at home and builds itself up internally. And we, you know, don't get into any entangling alliances like Washington advised, and that our influence on the world will be from our example that we set, that we show the world our growing standard of living, our increasing prosperity, our increasing dominance of technology and science. And that will be what we export to the world. It's a very anti-imperialist worldview that is really the best of America.
I would just make one further comment on this. It was the case that it was James Monroe that was able to secure Thomas Paine's release. And really all that was needed, I mean, they talk about neutrality, but in the words of Thomas Paine in addressing this Jay Treaty, it really was not neutrality. You know, they denied this faction, Governor Morris, who later signed on to the Hartford Convention after the War of 1812 to provide for secession of New England and New York from the United States. So it appears that not far from being a neutral figure, they were actually collaborating with the Jacobins at that time in collaboration with British, because there was secret negotiations going on with John Jay and Washington with the British over this treaty years prior to it being submitted to the United States. So they were adamant to keep Paine in prison during that period of time to keep him quiet. So
when was the Jay Treaty?
I think it was ratified in 1795, if I'm correct. And it was
when did negotiations? Because you say it started before that secret negotiations.
Well,
how far in advance before 1795?
You know, Thomas Paine somehow became aware of it during, I think, the 1794 period. And how he became aware of it was not known, but he gave a very deep and insightful critique against the Jay Treaty about what the provisions actually were, which he said subjugated the United States and its commerce to Britain.
Did he ever talk at all, Monty, about his understanding of British intelligence operations controlling France in the French Revolution? Did Thomas Paine ever describe his understanding of that at all?
Well, I believe he alluded to it. I haven't gone that much in depth, but there appeared to be networks which he was aware of a collaboration. You know, he had very volumes of letters to Monroe in which he alluded to that. And I think Monroe was aware of it, but even Monroe was cautioning Thomas Paine not to send these letters to Washington. In other words, Monroe, who came up with the Louisiana Purchase, as you know, and the Monroe Doctrine, and very close with John Quincy Adams. So it appears that, you know, the way history's been written, it kind of puts all the founding fathers into one pot like they were all heroes or something, but there was a war going on. And it appears...
Have you looked at Anton Chaikin's Treason in America on this topic?
I've got a copy of that. I'll refer to that. I'll refer to that also. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do as well. But I think Chaikin did some pretty solid research on Monroe's points of deep epistemological weaknesses, and when he became a stronger man, when the crisis burned him a little bit at the early and later stages. But the nuance of like these American patriots who are often really good, like authentic people, but America is like cluttered with people who are like authentically good, but epistemologically really underdeveloped, who try to do things that they're not qualified for. There's a lot of that going on, even in the founding fathers, as we saw. Even John Adams, who is not like a bad guy, but he had some big axiomatic, like degenerate weaknesses on the issue of hereditary structures. You know, it's not like he wasn't a traitor. He was willing to die for his principles, you know, as was Jefferson, even though he was a slave owner, and promoted that later on in the 1790s and after. But I guess it's just important to be aware of the nuance and how few people actually had the higher epistemological philosopher king level of awareness of the subtleties of what's going on. Very few.
Absolutely. Yeah, John Adams, he did a lot of great things, but he was vain and insecure. He had a lot of foibles as well.
Yeah. But yes, Monty, send anything you have in regards to Thomas Paine's writings on his understanding of the British intelligence operations regarding the French Revolution. I'd love to see that. That's something I'm hungry for. I'm sure Sam is too. Any other?
I screenshotted what you sent, Monty, so I'm going to look into it later. See if I can
Yeah,
find
Chris,
it.
I think it's well worth the endeavor. I mean, it's been as a point of consternation with me for many years now, and I've really had no one that could adequately address it. But I think it goes back to this thing about winning wars militarily, but then losing them politically. And I really believe at the time that if Thomas Paine had been allowed and recognized as a United States citizen, he would have been released and probably could have, because he wrote a number of pamphlets and papers thereafter, which were published in the United States on this treaty. It's interesting, in 1795, when this treaty was published in the United States, Jay and Washington were burned in effigy from New England to Georgia. I mean, there was a big outcry about this just based on their response to this. So I think it'd be well worth the endeavor.
Okay.
Anything else, Magdalena?
No, can you give us some words for the end?
Sam, you have any parting thoughts?
I have
Just,
no parting thoughts. Okay, I'm leaving it all up to you.
No, just thanks, Matt, for your continued support and friendship. It's always great to talk to you and read everything that you put out there. And thanks for this opportunity. It was a great pleasure to get into Thomas Paine for this. It's inspirational work, and hopefully we can keep it up with some Wednesday night readings into the crisis papers.
Absolutely, Sam. Yeah, no, and I really, really value our alliance and friendship. I've known Sam since
2009.
2009, that was it? Okay, yeah, when we were both doing some activism and found ourselves bring some awareness to the new world, around what the New World Order was during a Davos summit in Montreal on adapting to the New World Order, which Henry Kissinger was speaking at. And
that was literally the name of the conference. Yeah,
as well. But no, you've done incredible good work, Sam, and I'm going to sit down and tell you how to set up a Substack, and maybe doing a little weekly or bi-weekly little historical vignette video presentation might be a cool thing to do to both keep your creative juices flowing, but also really just your quality of research, your methodology is really solid, and you've done really great work. So I'd like to see that reach a broader audience. So maybe we could discuss how you can set up a little platform for yourself too that I'd love to amplify. So we'll do that next week.
Compliment coming from you, and of course, anytime I'm available to talk.
Wunderbar. All right, cool. So next week we have P.D. Lawton, who is going to go through. P.D. Lawton is somebody who is South African herself. She's based in the UK, but she is the editor-in-chief of the Africa Agenda website, and she has done some impeccable work on Cecil Rhodes and some of the battles between Rhodes, the Rhodesians, and the Transvaal Republic uprising, and a lot more. So she's going to go through a lot of that late 19th century, early 20th century Milner kindergarten stuff, and how that leads to understanding certain modern problems in South Africa and Africa more broadly that I think we all need to be aware of. So that'll be next Sunday at 2 p.m. And until then, thank you everyone for taking the Sunday with us. Thank you, Sam.
That sounds awesome. Can't wait for that.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheerio.